Welcome to Mysterious Goings On. We're going to get right to the show after these messages.
This is E.J. Findorf, author of Blood Parish, and you're listening to The Mysterious Goings On.
You know, I write mystery thrillers, but I don't write something called the police procedural. And I'll tell you why. I was never a cop, and if I attempted it, our guest today would probably kick my ass. It's Frank Zafiro, former cop, former Army intelligence officer. He writes popular, top-selling, gritty crime fiction from both sides of the badge. And you know what? I'm not going to continue this intro. I want to get right into it with him because I want to find out all the things I've been doing wrong, and I want to find out about his books, and I just want to have a great conversation with a really great writer. Frank, welcome to Mysterious Goings On.
Well, thank you. That's a hell of an introduction. I hope I can live up to it.
I think you will. I wanted to step back, and if it's okay, and I don't want to tick anybody off here, but I will anyway. But I just got through. I read a lot of these, but I just got finished with the Bosch TV series. Wondering if you caught it, because that's supposedly a procedural, right?
Absolutely. It is a procedural. The entire series that Michael Connelly wrote with Bosch, or they're all procedurals. They're generally whodunit procedurals. Some people sometimes I'll write whodunit, sometimes I'll write howdunnits. In other words, you already know who the bad guy is, but it's about how and if they get caught. Red Dragon was like that. You knew who Francis Dollarhide was, but Will Graham and the FBI didn't.
Thomas Harris, great book.
Yeah. And I still prefer the Michael Mann adaptation, Manhunter, for that.
100%, brother, 100%. Well, the reason I wanted to bring that up just is because I think that way, if people don't know what a procedural is, a lot of our listeners have probably watched that. I don't do it, until I go, oh, well, that's great. Let's talk about some other author. But I think it's a nice example of a procedural in your opinion too, right?
Yeah, I mean, and that one focuses primarily on one character. There are also ensemble cast sort of procedurals that maybe think like Hill Street Blues or NYPD Blue or something along those lines. Southland was kind of like that as well. So yeah, those are definitely procedurals. I think Bosch is a great show. I haven't started the final season that just dropped just yet. It's high up in my queue, but I discovered Justified, and I'm kind of on a tear there.
My all-time favorite, dude. Oh man, isn't Justified just a blast?
It really is, and it was recommended to me by a lot of my writer friends, my crime writer friends, Eric Beatner in particular. And I went to watch it, and I watched the first episode, and I dug it. And when I went back about a week later to kind of start in earnest with some binging, it had moved to Hulu, and I didn't have Hulu at the time. And so we just got Hulu for Handmaid's Tale, and sticking with it for quite a while now because Justified is pretty much rocking my crime world at the moment.
I love Justified so much. In fact, I know by osmosis aspects of it has found its way into my own work. Probably not Bosch though, because as I said in the intro, I'm not a procedural writer, and I'd love to hear, knowing that you were not just a patrol officer, but you were a detective, and then you were a sergeant and a captain. I mean, you've been through the ranks literally here of police work, and I'm curious, how about this? We've just thrown out some great pop culture references to the procedural. What's your feeling on the state of the police procedural? Are writers by and large getting it right as a former police officer, or are they getting it wrong, but it's okay because it's in service of the dramatics and the good story?
Yeah, some of both, I would say. There are some writers that just nail it. I mean, Bruce Robert Coffin is one of the best, maybe of writers you may or may not have heard of. I'm reading the first novel by a friend of mine named Mark Bergen, called Apprehension. And if people want a very procedural heavy, uh, get it right sort of book, this one is bang on for that. And that's not to say it gets mired down in the details. It doesn't at all. But it's a book that a hardcore procedural lover who really cares about getting deep into the details could love. And yet, if that's not your thing, it's not going to weigh you down as you go through it. But you're right. I think it's all about tending to the story. And if you're not out and out wrong with a detail, if you have a detective lieutenant in a small town doing, you could be off, right? I mean, you could have stuff that are my pet peeves sometimes that irritate me, maybe that would never happen, or that's totally wrong. Well, law enforcement isn't a monolithic thing, for starters. I mean, policing in Los Angeles versus New York versus New Orleans versus Mississippi versus Spokane, Washington, where I had my career, there's some commonalities, but there's a lot of differences. So to say this is the only way something could be done, or that's wrong because we didn't do it that way, that's just not accurate. Now, I mean, there are some mistakes that you just don't want to ever see, but I think you really hit on something. Is it helping to tell the story? Because the story is the most important thing.
Right. Well, the thing I think about, and speaking of Bosch, and I'm not going to give it away, but I think we can assume this, and it's probably in the past few years, because I just literally 3 days ago finished the series, and I'm going to miss that one terribly, although apparently there may be something later. But the thing where Bosch or one of his people, they get into a shootout and they kill somebody, but they're back at work the next day, right?
Yeah,
that never happens, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's completely unrealistic today, and actually has been for, 2 or 3 decades at least. Generally, when somebody's involved in a critical incident like that, there is a mandatory period of what we used to call administrative leave, and it's paid. There's no assumption of wrongdoing, but you were involved in a shooting or another type of critical incident, and while it's being investigated, or at least until the preliminary investigation is complete, you're on administrative leave. And so some of that is to take somebody off the street who, just did something that we have to determine, at least preliminarily, if this is looking like it might go right or go wrong. And the other piece to it, at least the first 72 hours, is a little bit of a chance for the involved officer to recover, essentially, to defrag from what happened. And because police officers are human beings, they are affected by what happens, and that's one thing that isn't always shown very well in TV and movies. Either officers are completely devastated in a way that derails their life and their career, so it's like a nuclear bomb of an impact, right, or it doesn't affect them at all. And the reality is, obviously, in between, some people are pretty severely affected, but everybody is impacted to some degree, and it can have a lingering impact. I mean, post-traumatic stress is real for everybody, and public safety folks, police officers, firefighters, medical people who deal in emergency response, or the emergency room. They encounter a lot of instances where post-traumatic stress could occur from that. I mean, it's good candidates for experiencing that. So, but you wouldn't have much of a story if the story went, chapter 1, get in a shooting, chapter 2, stay at home for 3 days to be interviewed, and then be off for 2 weeks while they clear you, right, or at least preliminarily clear you. I mean, that'd be, a boring story. And so there's harkening back to what you said about the license to tell the story.
I guess they could have a couple of paragraphs saying, and Sergeant Stevenson ate some donuts and watched a lot of Netflix. I mean, for 3 days or something, But yeah, but that's boring, and that doesn't keep the story moving, particularly in a movie or a TV show, because people want it to keep going. I guess you could in a book, right, Frank? I mean, you could easily do that and maybe explore that. And I appreciate what you said too. This is interesting. My brother's a first responder. My nephew's a first responder, and then I have a lot of medical folks in my family. But one thing I learned in my research, because my character in my series has PTSD, and in actuality, the people I interviewed interviewed said, actually, most people think you have to wear a uniform to have post-traumatic stress, which is not true at all. He said the vast majority of people who have PTSD that he's treated, at least, he said, childhood trauma, or domestic trauma, which is a stunning thing to think about. That's not to diminish that people in uniforms obviously get it, right? We all know that, but I think it's something that I don't think the average Joe knows.
And I heard something from a Medal of Honor winner, actually, who is now involved a lot in this post-traumatic stress, particularly with veterans, different programs to help with that. And he made a comment one time that the D in PTSD, he thinks it should be dropped. He thinks it's ridiculous because it's post-traumatic stress disorder. And he said there's nothing, it's not a disorder to react to some of the things that these soldiers, in his case, have seen in the way that they're reacting. To be devastated by what occurred is not a disorder. It's actually a very rational, human, regular, normal reaction.
Right.
And so, I mean, I realize the medical field calls it a disorder because of the impact that it's having on you being able to live your everyday life. I get that. But it's an interesting way to approach it, that it's post-traumatic stress that you're dealing with.
Right.
And so that really resonated with me and really stuck because I think he had a great point.
Well, Frank, let's talk about this work of yours. And I can already tell just discussing this with you that it's funny because I ask you what is it you do? You write gritty crime fiction from both sides of the badge. It's like that's your tagline. That's what you do, and I appreciate that. But do I detect though that we're going to find some not only the great procedural nuts and bolts that we're all looking for, but maybe is there some of this sensitive look at people's lives who do this kind of work?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The first series that I wrote, and still my flagship series, if you will, is the River City series. And River City is a very thinly disguised Spokane. It's an ensemble cast police procedural, kind of like we alluded to earlier with Hill Street Blues or Southland or whatever. And one of the things I kind of wanted to accomplish in writing that series, after, of course, telling a good story and all that goes along with that, was to humanize the police officers involved. Because, I think we're a society, and have been for some time, that sees people in kind of a surface fashion, and then label that, and then act accordingly. And with cops, it's the badge and the uniform that they see rather than the person behind it. And so one of my goals was, in the process of telling a good story and some fun action and showing some of the mechanics of police work that interest people, is to humanize those characters, to show you what someone like Katie McLeod is going through when faced with this particular horrific event. How does she deal day in and day out with now having 3 or 4 rather large events in her past? How does a longtime veteran deal with the realities of police work and policing, being a peacetime warrior, and how does that factor in? And just really bringing home the idea that these are people who are dealing with real situations that can and do occur, and are reacting in a very human way. And my hope is people read that and maybe they look at, the next cop they run into and remember it's not a badge, a uniform, and a gun belt. It's a person behind all that.
I find it interesting about you that you actually, started writing at 13. And you actually started working on, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, of course, your first book at that age. Now, last I checked, you were not a cop at age 13. So I'm curious, is this just something you were born to? Did you come from a police officer background family? Tell me how we got from 13 starting there and having this wonderful career in law enforcement and in military intelligence, and then got to today.
I did know I wanted to write from the time I was 13 and started writing very derivative stuff early on.
I've been there.
I'm sure you can relate. And I grew up on fantasy and science fiction, so a lot of what I wrote was related to that. And I wrote when I was in the military. I didn't really write any military fiction, a little bit, but very little. And the first book I started writing was the terrible quasi autobiographical dreck that every writer writes at some time and that will never see the light of day.
Right.
And that I'm incredibly grateful to the 2 or 3 mentors who actually took it seriously and gave me feedback back when I was, 17, 18, 19 years old. It wasn't until after I came on the job, I did a 5-year stint in the military, and then I came on the job in 1993, and started experiencing that my writing focus started shifting more towards crime fiction. And so I wrote the first draft of my first book a couple of years into my law enforcement career. But then it sat for about 8 years while I was busy going back to school. I got my history degree full time while I was working, and that took up a lot of time. And then I was writing police reports and learning a new job every year and a half or so. And so it really wasn't until about 2004 that things had kind of settled to a point where I could re-engage with fiction. And by that point, I was 11 years on the job, and so it was almost exclusively crime fiction that came out, probably 80%. And it just, took off from there.
Guess you never ran out of, triggers for material, I would imagine.
That is one of the things about having done this job. And I think if you talk to any writer who was a cop at some time, you don't have to slow down for the research, and you don't have to completely make up scenarios. I mean, a lot of what I've written in the past has had the flavor or the texture, of real life experiences. And I've stolen a few straight up lines that people have used, and always giving credit and getting permission where necessary. But I mean, I've been careful to make sure everything's fictionalized, and 99% of it never happened in any shape or form. But the texture of it, the feel of it, the sound of it, all of that informed it. And I don't have to go to the internet to try to figure out, whether or not, something about a gun or a procedure or am I understanding the rank structure of a police department correctly? Because these were things I just knew from having been around them for 20 years. And in fact, I've been a resource for other writers that I'm friends with who will, drop me a line sometimes and, ask for a fact check or a veracity check on something. And I'm happy to do that. So it certainly is an advantage. I mean, that's true of anybody in any field. If you were a musician for 20 years and you're writing, a book that is heavily, involved in music, you don't have to stop and learn music theory. Right. You got that knocked. And so I think that's what they mean when they say, write what you know, because right. that total genuine, sincere and what's the other word I'm looking for? That's just, it's bang on, it's accurate. Right. It really shines through if it's something that you're very familiar with.
The verisimilitude is important.
There you go.
Yeah. And that's the thing. And I agree with you. I find myself stealing lines from people or just making notes of things I've seen and trying to rework that, because it's just that, I think Stephen King said, that's like the flavor in the sauce, man.
Exactly.
You can be as far out in Pluto as you want, but if you got to pull people into something they can hang on to. So I like that.
And I've got them written down, and I think, a few of them still pretty good chunk of a few, but the danger is you can't shoehorn them in,
Right.
I mean,
right.
I had a couple of really great lines and I sat on them for, let's see. I retired in 2013, sometime in 2012 or 2013, a detective that's a pretty funny guy named Ben Estes gave me a line. And I think the book that I used it in finally was published in 2018. And I'll tell you the line, because I think he's hilarious, this guy. And I reworked it a little bit for the book, but he was a detective and he worked in major crimes, and he was kind of dismissive of people dressing like slobs. They're wearing their khakis and their golf shirts, and which was perfectly, or polo shirts, which is perfectly acceptable for casual business casual, but he had disdain for that. He wore suits and dressed up and thought detectives should do that. And he just shook his head one day and looked around at the bullpen and told everybody there that the days were over of people dressing like substitute teachers and first year realtors. And I thought that was such a good line. So I threw it in the mouth of a lieutenant, bitching off of the two detectives, because each one fit one of those particular descriptions. But I mean, I sat on that for 5 years. It was such a good line. And I've got a bunch of them like that, but you can't shoehorn it in. I mean, it had to fit to get used.
Okay, I got to ask this because I so rarely get to speak to an esteemed procedural writer in particular. Okay, the tropes. Okay, there's one I've got to ask. So, did you at any time, and did you as a captain become the boss who has no first gear? It's all third gear and shouting at the policemen that work for him or her.
That is a trope, and it was actually completely deconstructed really well by Mike Myers in How I Married an Axe Murderer.
I Married an Axe Murderer.
Yeah, his friend's a police detective, and the captain is super nice to him, and he's always trying to talk him into yelling at him. What's that actor's name that plays the captain? I always Alan something, I think is his name.
Was it Alan Arkin?
It was Alan Arkin.
Yeah.
And he it's pretty funny. I'm guilty of that trope. I have a couple of different times but when you've written 30 plus books, I guess you can be forgiven if something seeps in once or twice. I was never that captain. I was very consciously never that captain. And it doesn't mean you don't have to chew somebody's ass once in a while, but yelling at people really doesn't work very well. Talking to them does. Yeah. And so, no, I was never that guy, but certainly have written 2 or 3 characters who are, and, it's fiction. It's fun. It's having a boss like that it adds some humor or some tension, or gives the especially if it's a couple of partners, gives the character somebody to not like, to make fun of behind their back, to feel pressure from. Yeah. And so it's good to have a character like that. Maybe not as overblown as you've seen it in some places, but that's a big trope. The other one is the one you brought up with, bang, bang, I just got in a shooting and now I'm back at the street 15 minutes later, cleared from the crime scene, and that's all done. And that one bothers me. My biggest, most personally biggest pet peeve, especially on TV and movies where police work is concerned, is when especially a patrol officer, but a detective too, rolls up on scene of something super hot and dangerous, and they're about to go into the building to confront it, right? And they pull out their gun and they rack the slide on their handgun. It's ridiculous, and it kills me every time. I scream, because if you find me a detective or a patrol officer who rides around without one in the pipe, then I'd like to hear their reasoning behind it, because they're a unicorn for sure.
Seconds count.
A shotgun, that's different,
right?
But I mean, Wyatt Earp didn't have one in the chamber. That's because if you bump the hammer, the gun might go off. But we're a little better these days with technology and manufacturing of firearms. So that one. I scream when I see that. It drives me crazy for some reason.
When I'm again giving away my age. We might be close in age, I'm not sure. But so Starsky and Hutch, Captain Dobie. The first one I remember yelling at Starsky and Hutch all the time. You know what I mean? And I know Starsky and Hutch has its own, probably has a whole encyclopedia of issues. But I think it was a good relationship to a good buddy film, a buddy cop TV show. But the point was, I always remember Captain Dobie just like, one, he ate a lot of junk food. And 2, he was always at Starsky. He's mostly at Starsky, but because Starsky was a hothead. But here's one other thing, and I swear listeners are going to be like, "Oh God, Alex, did you really ask this gentleman this?" But I'm going to ask you. So Starsky and Hutch just happen all the time. And it's happened in other shows I've seen in the years. So what is it when you're going for lunch break? What is that, 10? What is that? 10?
That's a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier. Some people use 10 codes. Some people use different codes. That was a Signal 7 for us,
Signal 7, okay.
But so other people would be like, we're 10 whatever it is. I don't even know what the code is. We didn't use 10 codes.
Well, there's Signal 7, and they're at some place, and Starsky and Hutch. And, of course, Hutch is complaining because Starsky just got a chili dog with everything on it, and Hutch is like eating some wheat germ or something. That was their thing. But they get a call, and they would just dump the food out of the car and drive off. Now, does that happen?
Yeah.
Really happens. You're just looking at a glorious chili dog, and you just have to throw it out the window and go?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably overdone. But it depends on the call. You might, especially if you're in the passenger seat, you might be able to scarf while you're driving. If it's, maybe not it's not a burglary in progress or a robbery in progress or something, that's going to get, a code 3 response and it's priority 1 call. I've thrown things out the window, and I always felt bad because it felt like littering. But I mean, if I could secure it, I would, but that's the problem with a lot of that stuff. You can't secure it in the car when you're driving at pursuit speeds. And so that's why people do it. It's worse and better, I suppose, when you're at a restaurant and you can just get up and go, because if it's a place that you frequent, like we used to go to breakfast in the morning when we worked graveyard shift, the 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. Shift. About 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, when things have slowed down and you're stacked up in paper, we would go to one of 2 or 3 different breakfast places. And one that was pretty popular a couple of years there when I was on graveyard was called Waffles and More. And it was a local establishment, local owner, it was kind of place you'd like to spend your money. And they weren't cop worshippers, but they were solid, like you're just like the plumbers and the contractors and the whoever that's coming in, that you didn't get looked down on either. And they treated you like people and had great waffles. So if you had to get up and leave in the middle of your meal and they know you there, right, they would actually take your plate and throw it under the heat lamp for you in case you came back, and then if it got to be like 7:15 and they know you're off shift now, they dump it, obviously. But I mean, that's why you sometimes like to go with 5 or 6 guys, because they can watch your food for you or pay for your food for you if you haven't paid yet. And that's why the pack mentality can help out a little bit.
Well, see, and I was researching that for something I was working on, and on Quora there was a question about that, and a cop answered, and he said, "Look, I often would carry a $20 bill. If I had to get up and leave, they knew who I am. It's he's a regular. So I just throw the 20, and we'd square it later." He said, "Usually my lunch did not cost, or my dinner was not more, $20. It was far less." Yeah. That's a thing too. And
we used to do the opposite, in that we'd ask for the tab up front, because you're not there having an undetermined number of beers at a bar or something, right? I mean, you're buying
this is it.
Hash browns and bacon and eggs and a cup of coffee, and with free refills. It's it's $8.99 plus tax, and so just pay it up front. And then if you have to run out, well, you're losing your food, but hey, the business isn't having to deal with it. So that was another way to deal with it.
Well, Frank, thanks for indulging me in some of this stuff here. I know you didn't really expect to talk about that on the show.
I'm happy to.
Hey, Frank, I'm going to call a Signal 7 on this here. I think we need to take a break. Can we... I'm having a blast. If you're having fun, would you mind terribly speaking to us for just a little bit longer and coming back next week?
No, I'd be happy to. Just be careful. Signal 7 probably means something completely different depending on where you are in the country. So somebody might be thinking you're going to the bathroom for a little business or something. Who knows? I don't know.
Oh my gosh!
Come back, you bet.
And folks, in the meantime, before next week, be sure to visit mgopod.com for the show notes here, where you'll find links to Frank's work. You'll find a link to his website, which is frankzafiro.com. You're going to find the whole thing. But don't forget to come back, folks. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you get your pods, and it'll just turn up next week when Frank returns for some more enlightening conversation about police procedurals and writing and a lot more. Okay, who has a podcast, then writes an ebook about podcasting and doesn't do an audiobook version of it? Well, not me. I've done that. In fact, I'm very excited to tell you, dear listeners, that the podcast option, my recent top-selling ebook on podcasting, my journey through 15 years as a podcaster, broadcaster, host, guest, and observer, is now an Audible audiobook. It's really, really, really exciting for me to be able to present this to you through Audible, which is available on Amazon.com, where the ebook link is as well. And in this fast listen, my experience comes to you through stories, practical tips, and advice from my hundreds of hours as a guest, producer, podcast host, and more. And the podcast option, if I say so myself, is mandatory listening for those new to podcasting, and it should be a welcome addition to veteran podcasters' library. So check out the podcast option read by yours truly, Alex Greenwood, or as they say there, the J. Alexander Greenwood, because that's my pen name, and that's a long story, which if you dig through my podcast, eventually you'll find out what that means. But the point being today, the podcast option is available now as an Audible audiobook. I've got a link in the show notes to make it easy for you. Please do me a favor, go get that audiobook. Or if audiobooks aren't your bag, there's also a link for you to get it as an ebook. Again, the podcast option. I certainly hope you will choose it. Thanks so much for listening to Mysterious Goings On. Don't forget we have a complete archive of all of our interviews, monologues, updates, live readings, dead readings. All of that stuff is available at mgopod.com. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to us so you never miss an episode. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the usual suspects. Please join us there. Again, don't forget, mgopod.com also has links where to find me on social media and how to get in touch in case you want to be a guest here on the show. Well, I think it's time that I move on for this week, but until next time, keep reading.